Morning, y'all. Today we're going to put on some new shocks and struts. Keep it simple. For those of you who don't know, there's actually 4 shocks in the back, and I'll show you those a little bit later. Got some entry-level, affordable shocks. I'm not going crazy with Coney or anything like that. This is just going to be a daily driver, so I'm going to keep it simple. And we'll get it up in the air, replace the shocks and struts, and I'll try to show you how easy it is for a non-mechanic like me. All right, good morning, class. Today we're tackling everybody's favorite job, and we're going to replace the front struts and springs. So I've already got the car up on the QuickJack, and I've already done the driver's side. I'm about ready to do the passenger side. It's the first time I've ever done these. As I've said in most of my videos, I'm not a mechanic. I'm a hobbyist. So I figured out what I needed to do on my car on the driver's side, and I'm going to do the exact same thing on the passenger side, so you know it. So why do I have a chain laying under my car? Well, we'll get to that. But basically, it's a safety measure to keep the spindle or the spring from popping out and hitting me in the face. So give you a quick look at the assortment of tools and parts that I had to use. So the first thing, obviously, jack the car up, loosen the bolts on the lug nuts before you raise the car to get them loose. Mine's 19 millimeter, so that's to get the lug nuts off. Remove the tire. I have a 17 millimeter for the brake caliper bolts. And then the next thing I took off was the traction bar hardware. So the traction bar, if you have one, has a connecting rod that goes through the control arm. It's about a foot long, and there's a bolt and a rubber spacer. I'll show you when I get to it. But they're 13 millimeters top and bottom, and so you have to hold the bottom of the rod so it doesn't spin while you're trying to take the nut off the top. So I have a 13 millimeter combination wrench to hold the bottom of the connection rod while I'm trying to remove the top nut. And then on the strut mount hardware, you have a nut on the top, and you have 2 bolts with nuts on the bottom that connect to the spindle, or the steering knuckle, some people I've heard call it. So the strut mount hardware, I'll show that when I get it off, but the nut at the top is a 21 millimeter, and then the bolt head at the bottom is also 21 millimeter, but the nut holding the bolt on is a 24 millimeter. So I had to use 2 of those. And then the lower bolt is at a weird angle behind the dust cover, the backing plate for the front brakes. And so I couldn't get the socket and the wrench on there to remove it. So I ended up using a combination wrench to hold the bolt head while I was removing the nut. The screwdriver is basically to hold the chain in place so it doesn't come loose. A couple of different wrenches, like I said. So here you can look at the old versus new struts, very similar. Instead of this dust cover that is original, I'm replacing it with a new bellows. If you order it from I ordered this from Rock Auto, and it came with a new bump stop, but I also bought this strut mount kit from Rock Auto, and it comes with a new bump stop, so I used it instead. Springs from LMR with the polyurethane bushings top and bottom, and good old C-clamp to compress the brake caliper to get it off. And then I was okay using the smaller pry bar to get the old spring out of the seat pocket to pop it loose. And that's probably the scariest part for anybody, is a lot of people are afraid that the spring's under so much compression it's just going to come out and bust you in the face and hurt you. Mine, watched a bunch of videos, seen people do it all the time with pry bars, so I gave it a shot, and you know, it came out without exploding, so you're good to go. Getting it back in, I had to use my monster pry bar because there's a lot of energy in a spring trying to pry it into the spot. A couple of different flashlights, spotlight, regular drill to run bolts or nuts in and out, and this is an impact drill for those harder, more stubborn bolts. Soak everything in WD-40, and while I had everything apart, I cleaned it up a lot. So that's the rundown and the overview, and now we'll get to it. Here's a view of the old nasty stuff that we're about to replace. So the strut runs up into the fender, into the engine bay. You can see this dust cover is shot because apparently it was bottomed out pretty hard. These bolts are miserable tight because like I said, this cars are original, so that's a plus, but you're dealing with 40-year-old bolts, so be careful you don't break them. I got to soak them all in WD-40, and then the old spring with the sound vibration damper inside the spring there. So we're going to start by removing the 2 brake caliper bolts. Then we'll push this or lift this out of the way, tie it up so it's not pulling on the brake hose, and then that is the top nut for the traction bar connecting rod. As you can see, it's about 1 foot long, and so while you're turning this, the bar will try to spin, and underneath the control arm there's a head on that rod that you can hold in place to remove that nut. So we'll get those off. So to get this front strut off, really all you got to do is 2 bolts holding the lower bracket on and nuts, and then there's 1 nut holding the upper strut shaft in the engine bay. You don't have to touch these 3. Those are your mounting bracket to the upper mount, and if you mess with these, you're probably going to need definitely going to need a wheel front end alignment, so you don't have to remove those. Just that 1 nut, and the strut will drop out once you get these 2 off. What I'm also going to do is disconnect my traction bar link to give my control arm, my lower control arm there, more room to swing down, so that I can get the hub to fall outwards, so that I can get the strut out. And then always make sure when you're disconnecting the strut, since that's holding this hub in place, make sure you put a jack under the control arm so it does not swing down uncontrolled and the spring come out and hit you in the face. So as long as you have it under control, it'll be fine. And then make sure, I already have the car up on a QuickJack, but you can use a car lift or jack stands to keep it elevated. And then the jacks there, again, like I said, just to have the control arm lower slowly. Okay, just a quick note. You can see I got the upper strut mount nut off. It was a bear. I tried sockets, WD-40, a little bit. I don't have a torch of any kind. All I have is a heat gun. Tried a little heat on it. Basically, I've just been soaking it overnight in WD-40, coming out here and spraying it every once in a while, trying to break through the rust. You may have to work at some of these bolts, is the point of this. I finally got it to break loose with my impact wrench, impact drill. Finally broke it loose. And the problem is when you take these off, that dampening strut right there, that's the main strut, right? It's smooth, it's cylindrical, so you can't really grab hold of it with anything. So if you try taking that nut off with just a socket wrench, there's a good chance that the upper half of the strut is just going to spin with the nut, and you can't hold it. So that's the reason I ended up needing the impact, because it spins so quick that it'll spin the nut faster than that shaft can turn and back it off. The other problem with trying to hold that strut when you're torquing, when you're putting in the new strut and you're trying to torque down this nut to the factory specs, again, there's nothing to hold on to on that smooth round strut rod, and so you almost have to use the impact wrench again to spin the nuts faster than the shaft can turn with it. Because if you try putting vice grips onto this to hold it, or the new one, right, you're gonna scratch this up, put marks into it from the vice grips, and then that's going to eat away at the seals as it goes up and down in the body. So not recommended. But some of these bolts, if you're working on an old car like this, they are just stubborn, and the key is just try different things till you find one that works. All right, got the strut disassembled out of the way. Once you get take those two big bolts and nuts off the lower bracket, the spindle will pull out from the strut, and then you can just bring the strut down out of the car and out of the way. Now you'll notice the caliper here is still hanging by the tie rod, so it's not going to fall off or anything. Don't be afraid of that. And as you can see, I've got a safety chain around the spring just in case something slips, so the spring doesn't come out and hit me. And then the reverse of the strut removal is the installation. And put the new one in with the new hardware, new bump stop, new dust cover, and then I have a new strut mount kit that'll go on to replace this old hardware like this. Torque everything down to specs once you get it on the ground, and you're good to go. All right, there we are. Strut's all installed. Got the two lower nuts in, the upper retaining nut and plate. This is a washer, a giant washer. Got that in. Torqued down as much as I could with the impact. So there's a metal sleeve inside here to protect the rubber bushing, and so you only tighten this down until this washer hits the top of that metal sleeve. So I got that tightened down. New bump stop and boot. Now all I gotta do is get these nuts torqued down to 150 foot-pounds. And so it's a 21 millimeter bolt head, 24 millimeter nut, torqued down to 150 foot-pounds. Reinstall my caliper, put the tire back on, and I'm done.